Hello and welcome to another video on the best games of a letter, Arcade Edition, and this is for the letter M. Yes, in this video series I imagine what if I could only choose 5 games per letter per system and have to discard all others. What would I choose? So this means I'm not coming at it from the point of view of which games are most important to gaming history or even those which are most loved, but instead it's a personal list that for me I enjoy to play above all else. Now my choices here may surprise you, but this video series is just a bit of fun and a simple way of rekindling some old memories to help people give suggestions on what games to try the next time they're looking through their retro laden lists to decide what to play. Now this letter was really tough for me to choose, as there's absolutely tons of games that definitely need a mention, but none that are runaway favourites of mine personally. Still, there is, as I mentioned, countless items that I had to call out at least because there's so many worthy games. So this is going to be a bumper episode of honourable and big hitter mentions. But anyway, without further ado, let me begin. Okay, this brings me on to my 5th choice, and I've gone for Marvel vs. Capcom, released in 1997 by Capcom. Now, they took all they had learned from Street Fighter 2D fighter series, but in 1995 they grabbed the mega coup of releasing Marvel superheroes using the Marvel superhero license. And this finally allowed you to pit Spider-Man versus Captain America and the Hulk all battling it out in this fast-paced, more mashy spin-off of the Street Fighter series. So naturally it was a huge success. So they followed that success with more of rosters, introducing X-Men vs Street Fighter, and then finally Marvel vs Street Fighter. And all this finally culminated with this game, which included characters from the wider Capcom library. And so for me, this really is the pinnacle. This and its equally good sequel Marvel vs Capcom 2. Now this had a really generous roster with 15 playable characters and countless guests across both Capcom and the Marvel universe, and it's really so much fun to finally put Arthur from Ghost and Goblin games against Wolverine to see who would win in a fight. And both universes here are well chosen, with all the main Marvel superheroes, but other favourites such as Gambit and Venom also making their way into the choices. Capcom is the same with big favourites such as Strider and Mega Man, but they're rubbing shoulders with the best of Street Fighter characters as well. Now back in the day I played this to death on my Dreamcast port, which was pretty much arcade perfect, and it also received a pretty solid Sony PlayStation port as well. Now since then of course they've continued, as I mentioned, with Marvel vs Capcom 2. Unfortunately there was 3, which isn't as good in my opinion, when they lost something with 3 and Infinite when they went into 3D. But there is also actually well worth getting the Tatsunoko vs Capcom cross generations of heroes that appeared bizarrely on the Nintendo Wii of all things, and that is definitely well worth tracking down as well. But for me, whilst I do think the second in the Marvel vs Capcom series was its peak, with more playable characters and more mayhem, it's the first one that always keeps dear to my heart, as it's the first time I got to see beloved Capcom characters go up against Spider-Man, Captain America and the Hulk, and for me that was worth the price of admission alone. Okay, let's go on to my 4th choice, and I've gone for the game Metal Slug X, released in 1999, and this was essentially a director's cut of Metal Slug 2, with different bosses and reducing critically the slowdown that plagued the second game by this using the 3rd Metal Slug game engine. Now for those who don't know, Metal Slug is a fun run and gun blaster with great cartoon visuals, humour and frantic gameplay as you play Marco, Tama, Eri and Theo, and you rush around blasting several shades of everything and rescuing the bearded prisoners of war for extra weaponry or medals. The Metal Slug games are indeed a lot of fun, and whilst I don't personally worship at the altar to these games as some people do, I do enjoy them nevertheless. I really enjoy the chunky cartoon art style and genuinely funny animations, and for these reasons it makes it worth it for inclusion in my list alone. Now, I've chosen Metal Slug X over the others in the game, and there's so many, because I've always felt 2 was had the best levels and layouts, and X for me is a better refinement of that, with better music, different bosses, and easier access to power-ups. It's just a shame that some of the levels are set bizarrely at different times of the day, like the market, which is set at night in X, but much better being in daylight in Metal Slug 2. Now, back in the day, this found its way outside of the Neo Geo home cart onto the PS1, and of course since it was on the PS2 and PSP as part of the brilliant Metal Slug collection. Today, thankfully though, you can pick it up on Steam, GOG, pretty much most of the consoles, really cheaply, just under a $5 digitally, and so there's oodles of ways to play this fun little game. Right, okay, let's go on to my third choice, and for this I've gone for the Capcom 3-player classic Mercs, known in Japan as Senju no Ukami 2 or War for the Battlefield 2. So this is actually the official sequel to Commando over in Japan. Now, in this game you play 3 mercenaries from the Wolf Squad who must take on terrorists to rescue former US President whom's been kidnapped. I guess that means that old Ronald Reagan, who's been taken by these dastardly terrorists. Now, as someone who's never personally gelled with the overhead run and gun game like Commando and Ikari Warriors, there is something here that just clicks for me, making it just one of my favourite overhead run and gun games. Especially loving it as there's 3 simultaneous blasting in all directions if you play 3-player, making this so much mayhem and fun. I love the all-out action, the differing layouts, the power-ups, the weaponries, with each area having you up against an interesting enemy bosses and vehicles as you make your way through this fantastic game. Now, back in the day, I loved the Amiga port of this, with the ST and Amiga offering a pretty solid rendition, although not a patch compared to the arcade, of course. Having said that, at least you could play 2-player as opposed to the Mega Drive version that was criminally only single-player, despite being the most solid of all the home ports out there. Thankfully, years later on the Saturn and PlayStation, they did receive an arcade port of this game on the Capcom Generation 4 collection, but this was Japanese only in 1988. Years later, the Capcom Classic collection included this game, thankfully, on the PS2, PSP and Xbox era, and this really was a great compilation lineup with so many fantastic games. So if you love your arcade and Capcom, try and collect that game up today. Yes, overall, Mercs for me is the ultimate put your brain in a jar overhead run and gun. I think it's never been bettered in that genre, and therefore it's made my list here at the number 3 slot. Right, okay, let's come on to my second game in my list. And yes, I've gone for another cave bullet hell blaster, Mushihime-sama Fuchorai Black version 1.5, released in 2006. Now, this was their sequel to their 2004 game Mushihime-sama, and has the Bug Princess return again. Now, the black and the 1.5 of the Fuchorai game denotes that this is the tweaked re-release of the game that makes it a little bit less frustrating and a bit more tweaked music to the game. So you don't need godlike skills from level 1. It gives you at least till level 3 before it starts ramping things up. And so therefore this for me is the best version to play and try. Now, the game has a big convoluted weird plot, but to be honest, like all shooters, it doesn't really matter. What we have here is a gorgeous kick-ass bullet hell blaster that will have you grinning from ear to ear, and that's all before you encounter the massive big bosses such as a humongous dragon chasing you down in the beginning of the level 1. Now, the bullet patterns here are both insane and sublime, bombarding you with a dizzying ray of bullets on the screen, making your way through all these set exquisite artwork of the game and beautiful bullet patterns hitting you. Now, weapon modes in the game are pretty standard fare for a cave blaster. monster. There's a quick press of the fire button doing a standard shot, but holding down the fire button does a stronger, more focused shot, but slows the player down as you're doing it for movements. Finally, the second button has a limited but more powerful super shot. Scoring is very nuanced here as well, depending on which mode you play, as there's like an arcade, original, or ultimate, or mania, and therefore the most ardent score junkie will be satisfied as you learn and progress through this game. I also think worthy of note here is the fantastic music in the game, done by cave music veterans Manobu Namiki and Kimihiro Abe. They have really outdone themselves here with great techno tunes, but still retaining that naturalistic soul of the original music, and it all accompanies that on-screen action so well. Yes, overall this is probably my third favourite shooter, especially in bullet hells after Ketsu and ESP Galuda 2, and it's a crying shame that the Steam store only has the first Mushihime-sama game and not this sequel. So you need to ideally track down the brilliant Xbox 360 port of this, unless you're lucky enough to play it in the brilliant arcade club for real. Actually, if you can stomach the high cost of the Xbox 360 port, or you have a modded chipped version of the console, then the 360 port is the best way to play the game in my opinion, as it adds additional exclusive Xbox 360 modes, such as a novice setting, giving mere mortals a chance throughout the game. Still, outside that, as you can see, MAME does an amazing job here with emulating this, so it's worth giving this game a go. Okay, finally we come to my number one choice for the letter M in the arcades, and for this I've chosen Mr. Do by Universal and released in 1982, featuring a circus clown who must collect up all the cherries or destroying all the monsters. Often, incorrectly, this game is unfairly cited as a Dig Dug clone, but this game is so much more, and for me personally surpasses Dig Dug in every way. There's so many different mechanics here at your disposal. You can dig, as in Dig Dug, and cause apples to fall and crush the enemies. You can also hurl your power ball out down the tunnels to take out the enemies, although it will take a little bit longer to generate each time you use it. As mentioned, there's cherry fruit to collect, but also letters that spell out the word extra, also allowing you to progress. And there's even more, including prizes such as the monster's door, once it's exhausted, turning into something like an ice cream reward, giving you extra points if you go and collect it, or random diamonds appearing that give you super points and another credit. I think you get the sense. This is a deep, addictive, imaginative arcade game, and it's so much fun to play, and it's a real shame that it's often overlooked by its more common rival Dig Dug. I love also when you go for score in the game, it doubles the fun even more, because you get mega points for crushing multiple enemies with a single apple, or, as I mentioned, allowing that monster home to empty and pick up the treat, making you play this game in a totally different way, and it's like it was in Bubble Bubble. It makes it even more addictive. Now, Mr. Do did have some great ports back in the day on the ColecoVision and the Atari VCS, and also on most of the home 8-bit computers. Sadly, the Spectrum back in the day never got a Mr. Do port, a fact that thankfully was rectified in 2019 by former Ocean game artist Mark R. Jones and homebrew coder Adrian Singh, who released a stunning version for the Spectrum, finally rectifying the wrong of the Spectrum missing out on this game. Now, outside of that, this game did find a SNES port and did appear on the Wii Virtual Console, but this was the only time that you ever got to see the original arcade version of the game released. These days, sadly, outside of going to Arcade Club in Bury, which thankfully has the original cabinet there, your only option is MAME really, which is such a huge shame, as we are definitely overdue a Universal game compilation, as all of these games that they released of this time were so interesting. So there you go, that was my top 5 games to the letter M. Now there's oodles of big hitters and honourable mentions that failed to make my top 5 list, but I do think they deserve a shout out, so I'm going to try and mention as many as I possibly can here. Now of course the first big hitter is Miss Pac-Man, of course. This 1982 released famous hack for Midway by GCC does a really good job improving on the original Pac-Man in every way, with moving through different mazes and telling a love story between Miss Pac-Man and Pac-Man, who fall in love and finally wait for a stalk to bring them a new arrival. This is definitely my favourite Pac-Man maze game released in the whole entire series, as I feel it is true to the original but does enough twists and turns to make it far more engaging for me. Still in keeping with the big hitters, and it has to be Atari's 1980 classic Missile Command. Blasting out explosions in the air to take out nuclear missiles and defend your 6 cities across 3 weapon silos is surprisingly fun to play with a trackball. But I do get a little bored and frustrated with this game, as it so quickly ramps up the difficulty, and it just frustrates me in the end, hence why it didn't make my top 5 list. Now one I was personally surprised that didn't make my own list was Sega's Manx TT Superbike, released in 1995. I gave this a lot of thought, as although it's a really fun motorbike racer with amazing soundtrack and the brilliant Sega blue skies, I just felt, unfortunately for the arcade version, I'm hopeless at it, with all the riders disappearing in the sunset no matter what I do. I'm sure it's on me because I've seen people be really good at this game. It's really weird though, because on the Sega Saturn port, which I absolutely adore and have probably played the most, I usually always finish first in that game, so I'm not quite sure what I'm doing wrong in the arcade original. And I have tried the actual Manx TT arcade bike whenever I stumble across it, so I've tried the real thing and I'm still hopelessly bad at it. Okay, another big hitter that I'm sure will be on many people's lists and might surprise you that isn't on mine is Midway's 1992 game Mortal Kombat, or probably one of its sequels, Mortal Kombat 2. Now, whilst I enjoy this fighter and the great digitised artwork and brutal finishing moves, I've never really been as big a fan of this as others, preferring hand-drawn artwork of the characters instead. Now another fondly loved game by Capcom in 1990 was Mega Twins, of course, also known as Cheeky Cheeky Boys in Japan. Now I have a lot of love for this game, with it offering vibrant colours and cute enemy sprites, but gameplay wise this is not really too amazing in my opinion. I find it a bit overly cluttered and don't enjoy it as much as other people clearly do. Now another game that will definitely be on loads of people's lists and probably will surprise many that it isn't on mine is the fantastic Midnight Resistance, and released in 1989 by Data East. Now I think the love for this game probably has a lot more to do with the fantastic home ports released for this title, so many people's love comes from there. Now in the arcade form it's famous for being a run and gun with a joystick and a spinner that directs your shot. Now, I've always found this control mechanism a little bit cumbersome for me, where there's enough on-screen action that I can't do both at the same time without getting very, very confused. And so therefore, to be honest, for this game I tend to go to the Amiga home port instead, that allows you to do everything with the joystick. Now there is on MAME a hacked joystick version of the game that cuts out the spinner, but to be honest I don't find it works very well, and therefore it's not a worthy alternative to the original form with the spinner. Okay, another famous arcade game of course was Mad Dog McCree, released in 1990 by American Laser Games. This used real actors to depict the action and cleverly allowed you to shoot out and take out Mad Dog and his posse, who've kidnapped the mayor and their daughter. Now, I used to love these American Laser Games back in the day and was really thrilled when the Wii machine had both games in the series in one neat package, which is probably the best way to play the game today, officially that is. Now, another favourite of mine is Irem's Moon Patrol, released in 1982 and licensed to Williams. And this is a simple game, having you blasting and jumping your way through the moon levels, being so much addictive fun. In fact, I couldn't stop playing this the last time I went to Arcade Club, completing the entire A to Z lap. Then, of course, there's Atari's 1984 classic, Marble Madness. Now, this is a really unique game that is addictive to play, and even if it's a little rock hard once you go past the first few levels, but I do enjoy it, and particularly love the Amiga port of this, which is pretty much arcade perfect. Now, another big game to mention, of course, is Nintendo's Mario Brothers, released in 1983. Now, whilst I enjoy the game of flipping the turtles and making points, it's never really been one of my favourites, just finding after a while I get bored with the game. Likewise, there's Konami's Mikey. Now, I used to love this and play it quite a bit on my Spectrum, but the whole concept of bumping girls off their chairs and collecting hearts is all really rather weird. Not to mention the game is rock hard difficult, particularly in the arcade, so it's very difficult to get very far in the game, for me at least. Finally, for the big hitters, worthy of mention is Michael Jackson's Moonwalker, made by Sega in 1990 and based on that weird ass Michael Jackson movie of the same name. Now, once you look past the whole ickiness of Michael having to save kids in the game, this title was a huge amount of fun, with you using fancy moves and Michael's magic to take out the evil henchmen. All of this is set to a brilliant suite of Michael Jackson chiptunes as well, which is worth the price of admission alone. But there's so much batshit craziness to this game, from Bubbles the monkey turning you into a giant robot, and the weird phallic Thrustmaster robots attacking you later in the levels. Or of course there's Michael's special move where he makes all the enemies boogie on down to the music before they explode. Okay, so they were my big hitters. Let's now move on to the lesser known titles that I think are still worthy of your time. Okay, first we have Magic Crystals by Kaneko, released in 1991. This is a really fun platform shooter that is so much fun to play. It's all about collecting crystals and picking up the fairies strewn around the levels to make it to the exit. It has a great variety of ender level bosses and wonderful array of enemies to thwart, and it gives a real nice variety that holds you, quite frankly, right through to the end of this game. Well worth tracking down and giving it a go. Now, it's easy to dismiss Nihan Busan's 1987 game Magical Drop 3 as yet another Puyo Puyo knockoff, but honestly the whole concept of collecting the colours first and then hurling them onto another column really makes this suitably different to the Puyo Puyo games, and I find just as addictive. I'm a real fan of this puzzle game, I have to say. Now, this is an interesting one. SNK's 1983 game called Marvin's Maze, and it's really impressive, being a 3D isometric variant of Pac-Man with multiple levels accessible via elevators. This game is super addictive, and I find it amazing that this didn't make a bigger splash on release, because when you think of 1983, this looks so visually impressive compared to the competition. Okay, we have another weird one here with Bam Presto's interesting overhead 1993 racer called Masked Riders Club Battle Race. There's a mouthful. This is essentially a bump and jump style game that's well worthy of your time, as it's another hidden gem to give a go to. Talking of hidden gems though, they don't come more weird than this. Monster Farm Jump, released in 2001 by Tecmo. Now, this game is crazily good fun, having you play a monster who must bounce your way through the levels, reacting differently depending on the tile that you land on, giving it a strategic and puzzle element that brings a lot to mind of games like Super Monkey Ball. Yes, it's fast, it's slightly puzzly, and it's addictive as hell as you just go for one more go to try and reach the end as quickly as possible. Now, this is another old school shooter seemingly forgotten by many today. Yes, it's Mooncrester, released in 1980 by Mishibitsu. I really like this game. It has distinctive waves and enemy patterns that was really impressive for the time. Also worthy of note is the brilliant sound effects, which of course will sound very familiar to anyone who's played the tabletop grandstand Astro Wars, as they clearly lifted many of the sound effects from this game. Now this is another one worthy of a hidden gem mention, is 1985 Sega game My Hero. Now this was pretty much on the pit of obscurity until it recently had a resurgence by appearing on the Astro City Mini library that's recently been released. It's basically Kung Fu Master style beat 'em up, but with gorgeous fun cartoon graphics and music. Now it's brutally unfair with poor collision detection, yet it's one that I'm always drawn back to just give one more try, even though it is insanely difficult. Now I may have gone for the sequel for my list, but Cave's 2004 original shooter, Mishima-sama, is equally worthy of your time, with still the same gorgeous art style, great music and full-on gameplay. Only Cave seemed to deliver so well. Thankfully, this original game you can actually buy on Steam and places like that, so it's really quite cheap to pick this up as well. Finally, talking of Cave shooters, there's the brilliant and mad bullet hell shooter by Cave called Mushy Mushy Pork, all about pig girls riding flying motorbikes or something and rescuing pigs. It's mad, it's beautiful, and it's as playable as hell, even though it's only seen a home port on the Xbox 360, coming as a compilation with another Cave shooter, Pink Sweets. Still, if you have MAME and can run games like this fast enough, then this is definitely worthy of your time, because it is another great title. Right, there you go. That was my top 5 for the letter M. It was certainly a surprisingly tough letter to choose from for me, with so much choice. But overall, I'm really happy with what I've chosen here. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed, and I cannot wait to hear your own suggestions and thoughts of what games you would choose for this letter. So look out for my next video where I cover the letter N. And this is going to be another interesting and fun letter to play through. So until next time, keep it retro.